Hi all, my name is Eric, and this is a deeper dive follow-up to my first video about this music log spreadsheet for film and TV composers to keep track of music cues scored to picture using timecode. I have two more goals here for what I'd like you to come away with. The first is a set of best practices that can save you from getting into trouble when a project's in crunch time and you really can't afford to stop and get your tracking tools working again. And the second is just to demystify some of the spreadsheet magic that really makes this music log tick. So you can use those same techniques to customize it further, use in your own spreadsheets, or just to track down any problems that do come up. So, some best practices for you. Let's say the director is very happy with the first cue, but wants you to add some new music immediately after this one ends. First attempt, let's insert a new row above this one. Then we can put in the end time of the previous cue as the start. So 0, 1, 1 minute, 46 seconds, 2 frames. And let's put in a nice end time, 0, 1, 0, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But wait a second. So no duration's computing. And actually there's no such thing as frame number 56 in this frame rate. So why isn't our error checking turning things red? You can see that formatting did get pulled up from the row below it since the numbers are formatted correctly as timecode. But if we look in these gray cells, you can see that they are empty with no formulas. So an important general rule in spreadsheets is that formulas are not automatically copied when you insert new rows. One approach is to manually copy all the formulas in gray cells over. So I will copy these two down. But things still aren't working, and that's because you have to remember there are also formulas in these hidden columns off to the right. So I will copy these 4 as well. And then our error checking starts to work as we expect. And if I fix this frame number, we get a duration computed again. But that's all pretty tedious, so let's try again and see if we can save a few steps using copy and paste. So, second attempt. We'll start the same way and insert a new row above this second cue. But then I will copy everything from that row with Control or Command C and click this new row number and paste everything in with Control or Command V. You can see immediately that a duration gets computed since that paste also filled in formulas and all those hidden columns off to the right, which is great. Then we can delete all of the values that we don't need. Set a new cue number and title, and update status to not started. Okay, so let's try to save even more time and copy that first cue's end time over as our new start time with Control or Command V. And then we'll put in an end time, 0, 1, 0, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oops, no such thing as frame number 56 again, but that start time should be valid, so why is it turning red too? And the answer is that a regular paste with Control or Command V copies over more than we intended, and we should have used paste values only. I quickly mentioned this copy values only tip in the first video, but I'd like to show you exactly how and why to do this in both Google Sheets and Excel. The problem is that we've unintentionally copied over the conditional formatting rules that check for errors with the end time. You can see I've pulled up the 2 formatting rules here, one for the start column and one for the end column. But the cell E4, which is the one we pasted, also got included in this end time formatting rule because of that copy and paste. Now, sometimes we do want to copy the formulas in formatting, like when we copied over this whole row to start the new cue. But here, and this is especially true if you're copying from one column into a different one, we only needed the value. So I highly recommend using paste values only as your default choice unless you're positive that you need to copy along more. Let's back up a few steps and try this again the right way. So I'll start here and copy with Control or Command C is just fine. And then in Google Sheets, I can paste holding both Control or Command and Shift and then pressing V. Also note that this little clipboard box pops up whenever you paste things in. And if you forget that keyboard shortcut, you can always click this to open and choose Paste Values Only. Then if I put in our end time, you can see the error only applies to it. In Excel, sadly, pasting values is a little bit harder. On Windows, you have to first do a normal paste with Control V, then press and release the Control key to open that little clipboard pop-up box, and finally hit V to choose values. On a Mac, you can either just right-click, meaning two-finger click or control-click, and choose Paste Special Values. Or you can use the keyboard shortcut for Paste Special. Hold both the Control and Command keys, since a Mac keyboard has both, and then press V. You can then choose Values in that dialog and hit OK. Let's say you're careful when inserting rows and correctly use paste values only, but somehow still end up with a spreadsheet where things are just not quite working. How do you fix it? You could go through formula by formula and try to hunt down the problem, and if it's an isolated issue, that might work. Or, just like you make regular backups of your computer systems, you do that, right? You can make a known good copy of your music log at the start of a project before you start filling things in and having multiple people edit it every day. If you make any customizations like adding new columns, configuring statuses, so on, you can make those changes first and then make your backup copy. Then if anything goes haywire in the middle of a project, you can open up your working backup, make a fresh copy of it again, and then start copying over values. So we'll choose paste values only here, of course. Do the same for the rest of this. And now the formulas should all function correctly again. Two great resources I wanted to mention if you don't already have a good system for organizing your project, folder structure, and file names. Tim Starnes has a very thorough video on this on the Cinesamples YouTube channel. And there are also some great tips in Shai Razov's post about scoring films on a shoestring budget. I will include links to both of those in the description below. So what should you do if the video editor sends you more, let's say, creatively named video files every time? I'd recommend immediately renaming each video file you download to something a lot more structured with a current date, and then keeping track of file name you got and what you renamed it to somewhere, maybe another tab, could look something like this. So those are a small set of best practices that I hope can help you avoid some of the most common problems, so you can keep as much of your focus as you can on your music. I also consider it best practice to make sure you and your team actually get paid, so I think the cue sheet is worth spending another few minutes on here. It's important to wait until the very end of a project to fill anything out in this tab. That way, when you add, remove, or reorder cues, you won't have to redo any of your work here. Another tip, set the number of cue sheet rows per cue in the config tab before you start filling the cue sheet out, so you have enough lines for all the writers and publishers on every cue. If you aren't sure, set up more than you'll think you'll need, especially if you might be licensing any hip-hop tracks. I've tried to set this all up to automatically fill in as much of the cue sheet as possible, so all the cue names, timings, and usage codes will just mirror the values that you set over here in the tracker tab. By the way, if you aren't sure what those usage codes stand for, here's a legend you can refer to. All the automatically filled in stuff is, as usual, in cells with gray backgrounds, so you only need to fill out the parts in white. So let's go ahead and fill some values in. Note that when you have multiple writers, the percentage ownership should add up to 100% for all the writers on that queue. And then for multiple publishers, those percentages should add up to 100 as well. An important point to note is that you, as the composer, aren't the one that submits this cue sheet. The production company is responsible for submitting the cue sheet to performing rights organizations. Now, different production companies, especially the larger ones, might have their own systems and formats for submitting all this cue sheet data. You also might not have all the information you would need to completely fill out this top section. Put in whatever you can and coordinate with your production company to fill the rest out. This particular cue sheet format comes from a system called RapidCue, which ASCAP and BMI teamed up a while back to put together. There is an Excel version of it that you can download from either PRO's website, and I'll include a link to that in the description. If your production company will submit this cue sheet to PROs via RapidCue, they can just email the completed cue sheet to cuesheets@rapidcue.com. I will go over how to export all of this to help them do that in just a second. But even if they are using a different system, as many larger production companies will, this cue sheet should still contain all the same information they'll need to submit, so this tab should still be useful to hand off to them. Now, this tab doesn't exactly match the RapidCue Excel template anymore for a few reasons. For one, I've updated the formatting to use gray backgrounds whenever information is automatically filled in. I've also had to rewrite a bunch of the formulas so they work automatically with this music log. But the biggest change in terms of information are these TC in and TC out columns. If we open up the actual RapidCue Excel template, you'll notice that those columns are actually labeled time in and time out. And they're just in hours, minutes, and seconds, so no frames, so they're not looking for timecode values. You'll also notice they both say optional. And that's because when the queue occurs within a program doesn't affect royalty payments at all. So the only thing those fields are used for is computing the duration, which then does affect how much you get paid. So again, you'll have to coordinate with your production company on this. If they don't use those columns for their own reasons, you can just leave them blank. If they do keep track of start and end times, they'll have to convert from the timecode values into that hours, minutes, and seconds format. If you've been scoring a feature film divided into reels, it's very common for the first reel to start from hour 1, the second reel from hour 2, and so on. But then before distribution, all those reels will get stitched together into one big file called a long play. So the timing numbers we're really looking for are the times when your music plays within that final long play file, within the M&E stem, which contains music and sound effects without spoken dialogue. So let's say your production company will be using RapidCue. What should you send over to them? Ideally, you want to send them an Excel file that's as ready to go as possible. So I'd start by opening the blank RapidCue template in Excel, and then keeping our music log open in another window. And then we can copy all the data values over. Even if you're using the Excel version of the music log, I'd still recommend starting with a fresh copy of the RapidCue template. We'll start with the top information. For whatever reason, I found that these don't copy across from Google Sheets to Excel very well, maybe because of the merged cells with dropdowns. But for these, I would usually just type in or choose from the menus one by one. And then for the cues themselves, don't worry, copy and paste works just fine. But I have found that it works best when you do it section by section. So I'll start off with the cue titles and usage codes. At least when going from Google Sheets to Excel, paste values doesn't work exactly the same way. But there is something very similar. So I'll do a normal paste with Control or Command V, and then in this box that pops up, there's another choice called Match Destination Formatting that has a shortcut of M, and that will have the same effect as pasting values only. Then I will grab the durations and roles, then writers and publishers, and finally PRO affiliation and percentages. So this is all the info we can safely fill out. So you can go ahead and save this Excel file. Let's call it XYZ Q sheet. And then that's ready for handoff. You can also print a PDF of this music log version in case they need to see those start and end timecode values that you scored everything to, which they will then have to convert into the long play timings. Since this sheet extends way down, we can select from the top down through the last row we are using, then go to File, Print, and print out just those selected cells. Then we can hit Next and save this off as a PDF. So those two files are now ready to send over. Especially if it's a smaller production company, I'd send them a quick email with instructions noting the fields in the top section that they'll have to fill out and where to email the final cue sheet. While you're at it, remind them to send you a copy of that final submitted version. Before we get into the more advanced formulas, I wanted to show you two more things. First, how to quickly enter timecodes, and second, to quickly enter dates in the Schedule tab. In the tracker, all of the timecode fields are set up with a custom number format. The zeros stand for any numerical digit, and then those backslashes in front of the colons tell Excel and Google Sheets to insert regular colons between every two numbers. Without the backslashes, colons normally have a different special meaning. So then, when entering timecodes, you don't type the colons yourself, you just type in 8 numbers and hit enter. Over in the schedule, I've set these dates up with a custom format to show both the day of the week as well as day, month, and year. But when you're typing dates in, you can just quickly write, for example, 10/29, and it will still show up in that full format when you hit enter. The rest of this video will dive more into the formulas and features that make this music log work, which, fair warning, definitely gets into a lot more advanced spreadsheet topics. Let's get into a bit of the spreadsheet magic so you can understand how this all really works. Now, I'm not going to cover spreadsheet basics, so you should already be familiar with things like cell references, including what those dollar signs mean, and how to use formulas to, say, sum and average a range of numbers. If you aren't, go find a good video tutorial or two and then tune back in. But beyond those essentials, how do we go from a spreadsheet of rows and columns of numbers and text into something more like a little application with drop-down menus, automatic formatting, error checking, and so on? It's really just a handful of features, and those are named ranges, which help keep formulas much easier to understand, hidden columns and tabs to keep messy details out of view, data validation for those nice drop-down menu choices, conditional formatting, which we use for status colors and turning cells red for errors, and finally a handful of other more advanced functions, including the custom timecode functions and several already built-in ones. I won't go through every single formula, since that would make this video even longer than it already is, but I will show many of them in context. Just for reference, here's the full set of functions and operations used by this music log. I highlighted some of the more advanced ones, which I'll show you at least once, but if you come across a function you don't understand, use your favorite search engine for Excel and the function name, and you should find plenty of videos and articles to help explain how it works. So let me start with maybe the most complicated formula in this whole spreadsheet. You can see some cell references here, like E3 and G3, which I of course use in many formulas. But for cells or ranges of cells that get referred to again and again, it's much nicer to give them a name. So you may not understand this whole formula just yet, but you can probably figure out what frame rate and drop type refer to. And then QEnds is a named range for this whole end column. In Google Sheets, you can create a new named range by right-clicking and selecting Define Named Range, or you can manage all of your named ranges under Data Named Ranges. As you can see, I use these quite a lot. In Excel, you'll find named ranges in the ribbon under Formulas, Defined Names. Next feature. I've already showed you hidden columns off to the right in this first Tracker tab. You could put these columns anywhere, but since you don't ever need to see them or edit them by hand after you get the formulas set up, I prefer hiding them all off to the right side, just to keep this main interface that you use day to day much cleaner. I have hidden columns like that in some of the other tabs as well, and you can also hide an entire tab. So in Google Sheets here, I can find hidden tabs under this All Sheets menu down at the bottom left. And the Hide At tab actually comes directly from the RapidCue QSheet template that I imported, so let's take a look at it. And this tab hides a bunch of the data sources used in drop-down menu choices in the QSheet, like usage codes and this very long list of possible PRO affiliations. These were all originally set up in that RapidCue template as Excel tables, but since that's an Excel-only feature, I converted them into named ranges just so they work properly in Google Sheets too. Hidden columns are fairly similar in Excel, but there is no little arrow to show them. So you need to select before and after the hidden columns, then right-click and select Unhide. To find the Hidden Hide At tab, you can right-click any tab down at the bottom and select Unhide. We can set up drop-down menu choices using data validation. You can use a simple fixed list like the supported frame rates here. In Google Sheets, I can right-click a cell and choose Data Validation. This one is just a list of items where I've entered all the different frame rates separated by commas with no spaces. In Excel, you can find Data Validation in the ribbon under Data, Data Tools. Let's look at usage codes, which use a formula as the data source, referring to that usage named range from the Hide At tab. You can also use a named range that is more dynamic, meaning you might edit one part of the spreadsheet and change the drop-down choices that show up in another part. For example, the statuses are all customizable here in the Config tab, and you can see that they've been given a named range called statuses. And then back in the Tracker tab, the data validation just refers to that named range in the same way. And then to make the colors change dynamically too, we can use conditional formatting rules. In Google Sheets, you can set up a new rule by selecting one or more cells, right-clicking and choosing conditional formatting, or you can manage any existing rules that affect the cells you have selected under Format Conditional Formatting. In Excel, they are in the ribbon under Home Styles. And you can see for the status column, there are 4 different rules, one for each color that I set up. These rules apply to the whole status column, which is cells I3 down through I39. This first rule turns the background yellow if the custom formula here evaluates to true. Now there's not a lot of space to see it here, so let me show you the full formula on its own. The formula gets written in terms of I3, which is the first status value. But when it's evaluated for the next row, that will be replaced by I4, then I5, and so on, so that we look up each row's own status. This uses the VLOOKUP function, which is definitely one of the most advanced in Google Sheets and Excel. That stands for vertical lookup, and it's used to search a different part of the spreadsheet, here the named range status colors, to find the row within that range where the first column matches the value of I3, the status that we're looking for. And in that row where the particular status value is found within status colors, come back with the value in the second column that's right next to it, which contains the color for that status. Finally, if the color is equal to yellow, the formatting rule applies and will change the cell background to yellow. If not, one of the other three rules should match the correct color. Couple more details I glossed over. In normal formulas within the spreadsheet, you could just write status colors without this indirect function and quotes around it. But for various reasons, named ranges only work correctly in conditional formatting rules when they're referenced using indirect like this. And then that last blue false argument tells VLOOKUP that the first column it is searching over is not sorted. So lookups within sorted ranges would happen a little faster, but we don't want to sort our statuses alphabetically. We want them in the logical order that a queue actually progresses through. Another gotcha is that custom functions sadly aren't supported inside of conditional formatting formulas, but there is a workaround, and we've already seen it. In the Tracker tab, I just use the hidden columns off to the right to evaluate the TC error function and check for any problems with our timecode values. Then the conditional formatting rules can just look in those hidden columns and turn the timecode ones red if the error cells aren't blank. And then last up, for the more advanced functions I mentioned, we'll take a look at some of them right now in context so you can see them in action in the music log. I'll pull up the formula for this duration column. It uses a pattern that you'll see quite a lot, what I call this empty cell if guard. So these two double quotes with nothing in between them represent a blank value, and any empty cell will compare as equal to that. So before invoking this wall seconds to duration string custom function, this checks if column Q has any value in it. That's our duration in seconds as a number. You can see that column Q is empty for all of the rows where we haven't filled in a Q. And so if that column is blank, that will make the main duration in column H blank as well. This pattern is useful to prevent a formula from spitting out errors, or especially in Excel to prevent a bunch of zeros showing up in all of our empty rows. There's another pattern that helps prevent zeros from showing up in Excel, and I'll show you that here in the Q sheet. If this isn't a TV show, the episode title from the Project tab will be blank. This ampersand in this formula will concatenate, stick together two text strings, and that might seem a little weird since the first one is just that empty string again. But in Excel, this forces the type of the cell to be plain text, since otherwise Excel assumes that it was supposed to be a number, which would spit out a 0, as you can see here. Let's look now at examples of some of those more advanced functions I highlighted earlier. Summing and counting are two very essential spreadsheet techniques. The difference between those is that counting will just count up the number of cells in some range that meet some criteria, while summing is designed to add up a bunch of numbers. Then the more advanced functions of those will only count or sum cells where certain conditions are met. We can see both regular counting and conditional counting in this formula for the number of working days remaining. The first if condition checks whether or not there are any non-blank numeric values in the workdays range. This works only because dates are also considered to be numeric. If you have any dates listed there, it will evaluate this COUNTIF subformula. Otherwise, there's a simpler calculation that assumes you're working 7 days a week. What the COUNTIF does then is only count dates that are greater than or equal to today, meaning any dates that have already passed by are not counted. You can also do the same thing, but checking for multiple conditions that have to be met, as we can see here in this Progress tab formula that counts the number of queues that are listed for each status. It's going to count up the rows in the tracker tab where the status column matches A3, which is the status value for the first row in this progress tab. But there's a second condition too, which is that the duration in seconds column over here in this hidden column Q also has to be greater than 0. That way we only count Qs where we've filled in a start and end time. I also use basically that exact same pattern to sum up the duration of all the Qs in each status. So this isn't that interesting right now since there's only one Q in each status, but just for this example, let's put this third Q under not started as well. And then those two durations together, I'm expecting them to sum to 448.3 seconds, which indeed is what we see as the sum here in the progress tab. So the formula for this, rather than just counting cells, we sum up all those durations from the tracker, but only where the Q's status matches A3, here that not started status value. By the way, since I don't know how many statuses you will configure, it's a little bit tricky to cleanly mirror one row for every status value over here in the progress tab. So let me show you the formula that does that. What we're trying to do with each of these little expressions involving rows is to count how many rows we are down into this table of statuses. For an example, as we work through this, let's think about row 6 for revisions needed. So the row function with no cell inside those parentheses will evaluate to the current row number, so 6 in our example. If you give it a cell reference though, it will return the row number that you give it. So the second usage of row will come back with 3. You might wonder why I don't just write -3, and the reason is in case you add more rows above, Google Sheets and Excel will automatically update the cell reference in this formula to count from the right starting row number. If I just wrote 3, this formula would stop working correctly if you added any more rows up top. Okay, and then this rows plural will count up how many rows are in the range you give it. This if guard then makes sure that we don't try this for more rows than there are statuses, since the index function would cough up an error if we tried to do that. Index, by the way, can return specific rows or columns from within a range. In our example, remember row is 6, so 6 minus 3 will be 3, and then we add 1 to that to get 4. So we're going to look in the fourth row of the statuses named range, which of course gives us revisions needed. The same basic technique is what makes this whole Q sheet table work. But if you do go look at any of those formulas, just know that the math is a little bit more complicated because we're using 4 or some configurable number of rows for every Q. We saw VLOOKUP, vertical lookup, earlier as part of the conditional formatting rules that give us these nice status colors. I'll show you one more advanced usage of VLOOKUP, which is what powers the automatic population of performing rights organization in the Q sheet. This formula is a little bit nested, but the first VLOOKUP happens when there is a non-empty publisher selected in column O. If we jump over to the publisher's named range in the project tab, you'll see that the third column contains the PRO, which is what the number 3 does. Then the other VLOOKUP will look up writers. The problem is that the Q sheet separates writers into 2 columns, one for first name and a second one for last name. But VLOOKUP can only look up a single value. So what I do is concatenate the first and last name together, separated by a space, and then search for that full name altogether. Then in hidden columns within the project tab, I use the same trick, and then I just repeat the PRO value in the second hidden column, since it has to be to the right of the name for VLOOKUP to work correctly. And last one, I promise. Let's come back to what I said might be the most complex formula in this music log, here checking for crossed Q times. You've now seen all the individual elements, so the real hard part is just how nested this expression is. The first if guard, besides just seeing if column E, the start timecode, is empty, also skips running this calculation for the very first row. Since there's no Q before it, we don't want to look in the row above and try to do any timecode math, since that would trigger an error. And then if you look all the way inside this index function, that is indexing within the QEnds range, so the end timecode, column F. And then the row math will end up looking in the row number above this one. So why didn't I just write F3? Well, in an earlier attempt, I tried doing just that, but then we'd have a problem. Let's replace that with an F3 now, and I'll show you what would go wrong. If I decide to insert a new Q above this one, we're now in row 5, But Google Sheets tried to keep this formula referring to the exact same cells that it used to, and Excel does the same thing. So we're still comparing the end time of cell F3, which is now 2 cues back, not the cue right before this one. And so the row math with index makes sure we're always looking in the row immediately above. So finally, wall seconds between timecodes measures the time from the end of the cue before to the start of this one, and that will be negative less than 0 if this cue starts before the previous one ends. So hopefully that all further prepares you to get the most out of this music log. If you stick to those best practices, you should steer clear of some of the most common spreadsheet problems. And I hope knowing a little bit more about how this all works, you can really customize it to make it your own. Now, I'm happy to help answer questions whenever I can, but I also can't provide individual tech support to everyone. So I would definitely recommend making sure you have at least one person on your team with enough spreadsheet foo to understand the different features and formulas that I just walked through. Finally, check out my other follow-up video on the different timecode custom functions in case you'd like to understand how to use those better in your own spreadsheets. Thanks for watching. Happy scoring.